There is a particular kind of financial decision that is especially prone to being made by social contagion rather than by personal analysis. A decision where the conventional wisdom is so pervasive, so consistently reinforced by articles and conversations, and the expressed experience of people who have done it, that by the time someone sits down to evaluate whether it makes sense for their own situation, they have already absorbed the conclusion and are unconsciously working backward to justify it rather than forward to discover it. The decision to downsize the family home after 50 is, in my 4 decades of observation, one of the clearest examples of this pattern. Most people who eventually make this decision, or who spend years feeling vaguely guilty for not having made it, have never rigorously examined whether it makes sense for their specific situation, their specific financial position, and the specific life they are actually living in the house they are considering selling. They have absorbed the conclusion from the cultural environment and are either implementing it or resisting it without having done the actual work of thinking it through from first principles. My name is William Grant. The revelation I want to build today is not about whether downsizing is a good or bad idea. It is about the framework that most people use to evaluate the decision. A framework that is structurally incomplete in a way that systematically distorts the analysis toward one conclusion regardless of the individual situation, and about a different and more complete framework that, when applied with honesty to a specific person's specific life, produces genuinely personalized and often surprising answers. The standard framework for evaluating downsizing is what I call the pure financial yield model. In this model, the family home is treated as a financial asset that should be evaluated like any other asset in a retirement portfolio. What is its current market value? What are its carrying costs? What would the capital produce if redirected toward income-generating investments? And what is the net financial advantage of making the transition? This analysis is not wrong. The numbers it produces are real. A family home with $700,000 in equity, freed and redirected toward a diversified income portfolio, produces annual income that a person living in the house does not have. The opportunity cost of keeping the equity trapped inside the house is a legitimate financial cost that deserves explicit acknowledgement. I am not dismissing the pure financial yield model. I am pointing to what it systematically omits. What it omits is that the family home, unlike a stock or a bond or an investment property held purely for return, is also simultaneously a consumption asset, a platform from which a specific set of life activities are conducted, relationships are maintained, routines are practiced, and daily experience is generated. The home produces something beyond its absence from a financial portfolio. It produces a way of life. And the value of that way of life, while it cannot be entered into a spreadsheet in the same way that investment returns can, is no less real and no less consequential to the total welfare of the person making the decision. The pure financial yield model treats this production as zero, as if the home's non-financial output were neutral or irrelevant to the analysis. It is neither, and its omission is what makes the standard framework structurally incomplete and systematically biased toward the sell conclusion, regardless of the individual situation. The complete framework is what I call the total yield analysis, and it begins with a question that most people approaching the downsizing decision have never explicitly asked themselves. What does this house produce, and at what cost? And is the production worth the cost? The financial cost is knowable and well documented. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and the implicit yield foregone on the trapped equity. The financial production is also knowable. The housing services the home provides, which have a market value equal to the rent that an equivalent property would command in the local rental market. These two numbers together produce the net financial cost or benefit of ownership compared to renting an equivalent space, which is a very different and more honest calculation than simply comparing the trapped equity to what it would earn in a portfolio. But the non-financial production is equally real and more consequential for many people, and it is this production that the pure financial yield model ignores entirely. Let me describe what I mean by non-financial production in concrete terms, because this is where the analysis becomes specific and where the standardized advice fails individual situations most dramatically. A family home that has been the center of an established social life for 2 decades produces ongoing social capital, the proximity to neighbors who have become genuine friends, the accessibility of community institutions and relationships that took years to build and that do not transfer when the person moves. A home with a garden that has been developed and refined over many years produces daily pleasure and creative expression that a condominium or a smaller apartment cannot replicate. A home with a dedicated workspace, a studio, a workshop, or a large kitchen that has become the site of meaningful activity produces the physical infrastructure of that activity, and relocating to a smaller property means either abandoning the activity or finding alternative facilities at additional cost and inconvenience. A home with guest rooms that accommodate extended visits from adult children and grandchildren produces family connection at a quality and frequency that cramped alternative accommodations do not allow. I want to be specific about someone I worked with because the abstract principle becomes most useful when it is anchored in a real situation. His name was Clifford, 62 years old, recently retired after a distinguished academic career, who came to our initial conversation carrying the assumption that downsizing was obviously the right financial move and wanting my help in figuring out the timing and the mechanics. His house was large for 2 people by conventional metrics. His children were established in other cities. The financial case for selling was apparently clear. What became apparent as we worked through the total yield analysis was that the house was doing something for Clifford's life that was not visible in the financial calculation, but was central to the quality of the retirement he was actually living. Clifford's home was the site of a weekly seminar he had been hosting for 12 years, an informal gathering of academic colleagues and graduate students that had become the intellectual center of his retired life. The house had the space for it, the library that gave it intellectual character, the dining room that allowed it to become a social event as well as an intellectual one, and the 30 years of accumulated personal history in every room that gave it an atmosphere of accumulated meaning no new space could replicate for at least a decade. The house also had the guest suite that his daughter used every 6 weeks when she came from Seattle with his 2 grandchildren, a visit pattern that both generations had built around the house's capacity and that would necessarily change in a smaller property. And it had the garden workshop, where Clifford was doing the cabinet making he had deferred for his entire working life, and which was, by his description, the most absorbing and satisfying activity he had ever pursued. When we calculated the actual financial cost of maintaining the house against Clifford's retirement income, pension, Social Security, portfolio distributions, the carrying cost was fully manageable. The opportunity cost of the trapped equity was real, but not acutely distorting. The house was not creating financial pressure that demanded resolution, and the non-financial yield it produced, the seminar, the grandchildren visits, the workshop, was not replaceable in any smaller property at any realistic alternative cost. The total yield analysis produced a conclusion that was not what Clifford had arrived expecting. He should not sell, and the social pressure he felt to sell was not based on his actual situation, but on the conventional wisdom about situations like his in the aggregate, which masked the specific features of his situation that made it genuinely different. The revelation that organizes this analysis is simple but consequential. The family home after 50 is not one type of asset. It is at minimum two: a financial asset with opportunity cost characteristics and a life infrastructure asset with production characteristics that are specific to the individual situation and cannot be standardized or averaged without losing the information that matters most. Treating it as only the first type produces a biased analysis. Treating it as both types, with honest accounting on both dimensions, produces a decision that is actually calibrated to the individual situation rather than to the statistical average of all situations that superficially resemble it. The cases where downsizing clearly makes sense, and there are many, are cases where the financial cost has crossed the threshold of genuine affordability, where the physical demands have crossed the threshold of genuine management capacity, or where the non-financial production has genuinely diminished because the life that the house was built around has changed fundamentally enough that the production is now more hypothetical than real. When adult children live 1,200 miles away and visit once a year, the guest room is not producing family connection. It is storing furniture. When the garden has become an obligation rather than a pleasure, the large lot is not producing creative expression. It is producing anxiety. When the neighborhood relationships have dissolved through the ordinary attrition of time, and the house no longer anchors a social world, the location is not producing community. It is producing nostalgia for a community that no longer exists there. The honest version of the total yield analysis requires you to look at each category of non-financial production with the same unsentimental clarity that you would apply to the financial calculation. Not what the house produced when your children were teenagers, but what it is producing now. Not what the garden was when your spouse maintained it with passion, but what it is now. Not what the neighborhood was 15 years ago, but what your actual relationship to it is today. That honesty is uncomfortable, which is why most people avoid it and default instead to the conventional wisdom that tells them what to do, without asking them to look clearly at what is actually true about their specific situation. Your task this week: the one concrete thing I want you to do before this conversation loses its clarity is to spend 30 minutes writing down for each major category of non-financial production the house currently enables, whether that production is genuinely active or whether it is more memory than present reality. The seminar or the gathering that still happens, or the one that stopped 3 years ago and has not been missed as much as expected. The guest visits that still occur regularly, or the guest room that has been used twice in the past 2 years. The workshop projects that are in progress, or the tools that were last touched in a different season of life. That inventory, done honestly, combined with an equally honest look at the financial carrying cost, is the complete analysis. Not the conventional wisdom, the complete analysis.